Last week, we talked about how God and AA make a very strong suggestion that we deal with our past and that we make a list of people that we have wronged in our lives. And not only that, we take it to the next step and ask God to work on our hearts so that we might be willing to be able to reconcile these broken relationships. And the verse that we used was Matthew 5:24. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Now, we looked at Esau and Jacob, two brothers who had a little falling apart, and but God told them that they needed to work through this and get back together and reconcile things. And then I asked you to go home and think about people in your lives that God might ask the same thing of. Well, tonight, for step 9 in the 12-step program, it takes us to that next step. And it reads, we made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So the example that I'm using tonight is that of Abram and Lot. You know, I find it interesting that the Bible, from the very beginning in Genesis, we're dealing with reconciliation. So I don't know why we think that it's so hard today. You'd think we would have gotten it after all these thousands of years, that we would have figured it out. But it's just something that is part of sin in our world, and it's a problem. So if you want to turn to page 10 in your Bibles, you can follow along. We're going to read Genesis 13, and it's the first 12 verses. And the first half of these are really background as to what's happening, so it may sound a little strange as we start. Genesis 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. And he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, being between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first, meaning that he had been there before. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. So that's the background. Verse 8 gets to the core of this. Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. And this was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. And thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now, I just want to give you a quick refresher as far as all these places and everything. I think sometimes we forget how much Abram traveled. And so I have a map for you that you can see. You can see where is, where he started, and then he went north, and then he went down into Canaan, and then he went down into Egypt, and then he ends up back in Canaan. So it kind of gives you an idea of how much of the country that he covered in his lifetime. And keep in mind, this is all on foot. This is all with his family and with all of his livestock. This was no easy task. But at least it kind of gives you an idea as to where in the world Abram and Lot were. Now, when they came out of Egypt and they're back in Canaan, the land only has so many resources, and there's a lot of desert there. So places for the livestock to graze and plenty of water for the people and the animals was limited, and so the herdsmen started fighting. The Bible doesn't tell us whether Lot and Abraham got into it or not, but we do know that their servants did. And so Abram knew that the fighting was wrong, and he wanted to put an end to it. And so we just read what happened and how the story went. So his plan was to maintain his family. He said, Lot, you're my kinsman, you're my nephew. We can't let this separate us. And so that was the primary goal for Abram, and that was what was important to him. And here's what he did that I think is interesting, because I come from a family with a lot of internal bickering, and I know many of you do and things. And so I think that this is interesting because I don't think any of us appreciates that in our families. So the first thing for Abram was that it wasn't about him. This wasn't about, I'm the older, I have more rights, and all of that. It was not about Abram at all. And he was willing to even allow Lot to pick which piece of land he wanted. And I think that his attitude was a godly attitude. And I say that because of Romans 8:6. It reads, "For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace." Abram wasn't looking at life. He wasn't looking at the wealth that they had or anything like that. He wanted peace in his family because he knew that would be pleasing to God. And I think it's interesting that the land that Lot chose was clearly the better land, but that eventually he would end up fleeing from that land and it would be destroyed because that, he moved there before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. So I think that that's an interesting thing to note too about Lot's choice. Now, Abram was also willing to sacrifice for peace. And Dr. Phil has a saying, and it's, you can be right or you can be happy. And Abram was about being happy, about keeping peace in his family. And so many times we get so caught up in what's right or wrong in a relationship. Abram didn't seem to waste any time trying to figure out who was right and who was wrong. Because I guarantee you, 99% of the time, you're both right and you're both wrong to some degree. And so he didn't waste any time on that stuff. So, I don't think he had an ulcer or anything over this issue. And then a lot of times we get hung up on an eye for an eye. And even though Christ hadn't said these words yet, Abram was acting by turning the other cheek. Whatever you want, Lot, you can have it. I'm not going to fight you on it. We're family, and so you just, take what you want. He was not being selfish in any way, shape, or form. And the last thing that I notice about Abram is that he wasn't worried about the fairness of all of this. Last week somebody asked, well, if you go to make right with somebody and they don't want to admit their part in it, what do you do? Or, if they don't ask for forgiveness. Abram didn't give Lot a chance. It was all about keeping the peace. It wasn't about fair. It wasn't about right. It wasn't about, well, let's divide the land so we both get the good land and the bad land. It had nothing to do with fairness. And we often get caught up in that. And I think our society kind of fosters that kind of an attitude because we think everything in life should be fair. We talk about our justice system and things are fair, and politically right now it's all about, fairness and nothing's fair, and the only being that is fair is God. And thankfully, he's got way more grace than fairness, because if he gave us what we deserved, it wouldn't be a good thing. So one of the things that the AA steps do, like last week it talked about making a list, and this week it says, okay, now fix it. The writers of the 12 steps learned that you have to walk before you run. And they also learned that it's a process. And it's interesting that we just think this stuff is going to happen. And people go through these AA programs, and I've seen them, and they're in rehab for 28 days, so they're going to go through all 12 steps, and they're going to come out all better. And some of the programs lead them to believe that they are. And then they struggle, and they don't realize that it's a process, and the time length is different for everybody. I may struggle with gossip, and Marilyn, maybe you struggle with sticky fingers or something. We all have different issues, and it takes us a different length of time to deal with those things. And we forget that. We kind of want to speed things up. And I'm going to be real honest with you here. As you tick off the list that you made and you cross off the people that you've offended, it's just like a to-do list. God's going to bring something else to mind. So, we're never going to be perfect while we're here. So don't beat yourself up when it doesn't happen. Now, we talked about avoidance last week and how easy that is for most of us to avoid things. But we can go the other extreme, and we can jump in too early. And we may feel that we want to talk to somebody about something, and they're not ready. And that's why we really need to lean on the Holy Spirit to guide us and to give us opportunities to talk. Because if we go in too soon, it's just like the obnoxious person that decides they're going to enter the pool by the cannonball method and just disrupt everybody around the pool, versus the person who dives in or just, gets in gracefully. And we can do more harm than good sometimes if we do it on our time. And the biggest problem is that, first of all, God needs to prepare our hearts, but he also has to work on the heart of the person that we're going to talk to. And so we don't go into this alone. We go into this with God. Now, I'm going to give you some specific tips on how you can try to do this. There's a lot of models out there, but I'm going to take the one that AA suggests, and they call it making amends, which ties into this particular step. So the first thing is you can't worry about who's at fault. And we had a lot of discussion about that last week. It's not about who's at fault. Figure out what you did wrong. You had a role in it, and it may have been as simple as you reacted the wrong way, or you had expectations that weren't met. It could have just been an off day for you, and you didn't respond as well as you could have. Maybe you opened your big mouth when you weren't supposed to. It could be any one of a number of things, and you need to figure out what your role is in this discord. And then, I can't emphasize this enough, go in with no expectations. If we lived life with very low or no expectations, we would save ourselves the bulk of our disappointment. And if you go in with no expectations, you could walk away surprised at how well they responded. So, if you want to avoid disappointment, just get rid of all those expectations. You don't want people to expect you to do certain things and respond in a certain way. And it's not fair for us to do that to other people. So that's the first thing. Admit your mistake. Then ask for forgiveness. And even if they don't see what they did wrong, even if they want to put all the blame on us, we know in our hearts what we did wrong. God showed us. We've confessed it to God. God's going to forgive us. We need to ask this person for forgiveness, because it's not about either of us. It's about the peace between us. That's what God is requiring. Abram didn't worry about who was right or wrong. He didn't worry about, who had the bigger herd, or whose servant started it, or any of that kind of stuff. It was just about maintaining the peace. And when I struggle with that, because I think it's natural, I like to believe it's natural for all of us to kind of struggle with eating that humble pie, I remind myself that I stand alone before God in judgment. And nobody else that I've interacted with is going to be there, and I can't pass the buck to any of them. It's just God and me. And if I look at life that way, now, I think it's easier down the road when I think about that. It's just between God and me, and I can't own what you do or what you say. I can only own my heart and my thoughts and my actions. And so we need to have that approach when we ask for forgiveness, because we've all experienced this. You go to the person and, and it's hard, and you go in and you ask for forgiveness, and they come back with, well, what about this, and what about this, and and now they've got this long litany of things for you, and you didn't even know you did any of that stuff. So it's not an easy road to take. Then when you go into this meeting, the third step, take an idea or two with you. I think it's easier than going in and saying, because you're probably catching them out of the blue, and rather than go in and say, hey, we have this problem with this, what do you think we should do to fix it? That puts the person on the spot. They don't necessarily, have an answer for you. Now they're feeling a little tense, and that's just not a fair thing to do. But if you put thought and prayer into it, God can give you some ideas as far as what to do. I mean, that's what Abraham did. He came up to Lot and he said, so what do you think? We can't have this fighting. Maybe we should split up, and you can have some land and I'll take the other. And Lot didn't seem to have a problem with it. You do need to keep your mind open, though, in case the other person does have an idea. And it may even be better than your ideas. So again, it's not about you, it's about keeping the peace. And the last step is changing our behavior. And for Abram, it was a type of separation. And we forget that. So many times we think that everybody has to live together and everybody has to get along and everything is wonderful. And we have this idea of utopia, and that relationships can exist where we get along and there's no animosity or hatred or anything, and yet there's some separation between us. Maybe somebody's not healthy for you. Maybe they have a habit that would just drag you down. And don't worry about it. And so separation might be okay. And if you can accept that, you might do better with reconciling. And keep in mind as well that God's the only one who changes us. If we think we can change ourselves, we're lying to ourselves. God's the only one who can change us. So we really need to spend some time on our knees if we want to have that change happen. And if you become the only one that you can fix, which is what I've said, you're going to need to be focusing on that knee time. You're never going to please everybody. You have to accept that in life. Everybody's not going to like you. I mean, that's a hard awakening for some of us. But guess what? We don't like everybody either. So, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. We can have peace and we can live in peace, but it doesn't mean that we have to be best friends and we have to live together and all of those kinds of things. Unless it's your spouse, then you're going to want to take a different approach. I don't want you going home and telling Kay that I gave you permission to be bad. So I do want to touch on the second part of the step. And, it talks about doing no harm. And Hippocrates put that, in some of his writings, do no harm. And don't go and confess something to somebody that they have no idea about. I think about the person who had an affair 15 years ago, the conscience is bothering them, so they decide it's time to go to the spouse and confess it all. Why would you hurt a person? You need to deal with your conscience and you need to deal with your sin with God and with the other person, but don't bring in an innocent person and crush them. That's not thinking about them. Easing your own conscience is not the same as thinking about somebody else and helping them with something. So keep in mind that reconciliation is not about you. And so if what you want to do is going to hurt somebody else, maybe you gossiped about somebody and they don't have a clue. And you go up to them and you say, oh, I'm sorry, I said all of these things behind your back. Really? Why do they have to know what you did? It's an important part of this. So I just want to close with the Bible verse that we started with, in Matthew 5:24. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift.